At my family's Sunday dinner, my son's girlfriend smiled politely while my sister asked if people in South Africa still lived in mud houses. Nobody stopped her, not even me. I just sat there gripping my wine glass while the room filled with awkward little laughs. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end. And tell me what city you're watching from. Sometimes it helps to know kindness still exists somewhere in the world. For most of my life, I believed our family carried itself with dignity. We weren't loud people. We lived in a gated neighborhood outside Chicago where every lawn was trimmed to perfection and every dinner party felt like a competition nobody openly acknowledged. My late husband built our family's investment firm from nothing. And after he passed away 8 years ago, my son Adrian became the face of the company. At 34, Adrian was everything people admire in America. Handsome, educated, successful. Women chased him constantly, though he rarely brought anyone serious home. So when he called me one Thursday evening and said, "Mom, I want you to meet someone important," I'll admit my heart lifted a little. I thought maybe this would finally be the beginning of something warm again. Something that felt like family instead of business meetings and polite holiday brunches. "She's nervous," Adrian had warned me gently over the phone. "Please make her feel welcome." "I always do," I told him. At the time, I meant it. Sunday arrived cold and gray. The kind of March afternoon where the sky hangs low over the suburbs like damp wool. I spent hours preparing dinner myself even though we had staff. Pot roast. Rosemary potatoes. Fresh biscuits. The same meal Adrian used to beg for when he came home from college. By 5 o'clock, the house smelled warm and familiar. Candles flickered softly across the dining table while my sister Patricia criticized the flower arrangement before she'd even taken off her coat. "Lilies would have looked more elegant," she murmured. Patricia had opinions about everything. Especially people. My brother-in-law laughed while pouring himself bourbon. My niece Madison sat scrolling through her phone in designer heels that probably cost more than my first car. Then the front door opened. And Adrian walked in beside the most beautiful young woman I had ever seen. She was tall and poised, with warm brown skin and soft dark curls pulled neatly behind her shoulders. Her cream-colored coat looked elegant without trying too hard. She carried herself quietly, almost carefully, like someone entering a room where she already expected not to belong. "This is Naledi," Adrian said. Her accent carried traces of London mixed with something softer underneath. She smiled at me first. Not the fake social smile I'd seen 1,000 times at charity galas. A real one, nervous but sincere. "It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore," she said softly. I remember thinking how graceful she sounded. Then I noticed the silence around the room. The kind of silence that isn't silence at all. The kind filled with judgment. Patricia's smile tightened immediately. Madison looked up from her phone with visible surprise before exchanging a glance with her mother. And my brother-in-law leaned toward Adrian with a grin that already made me uncomfortable. "Well," he chuckled, "didn't expect that." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. Naledi pretended not to notice. I should have said something right then. Instead, I invited everyone to the dining room like a coward trying to keep the peace. Dinner began politely enough. Questions about travel, work, Chicago weather. But underneath every conversation sat something ugly and growing. Patricia tilted her wine glass toward Naledi and asked with artificial sweetness, "So where exactly are you from?" "Originally Johannesburg," Naledi answered calmly. Patricia nodded slowly. "My goodness, that must be very different from here." Naledi smiled faintly. "In some ways." Then Madison laughed under her breath. "I just hope Adrian knows what he's getting into," she muttered. The table went quiet again. Adrian looked furious now. But Naledi? She simply lowered her eyes toward her untouched plate and folded her hands carefully in her lap. And for the first time that evening, shame began creeping into my chest. The rest of dinner unfolded the way disasters usually do in wealthy families. Quietly. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody slammed a hand against the table. That would have been too vulgar for people like us. Instead, the cruelty arrived wrapped in polished smiles and careful little comments that could always be denied later. Patricia cut into her roast before glancing at Naledi again. "So, she said lightly. What do your parents do? Naledi folded her napkin neatly before answering. My mother works in education. And your father? There was a brief pause. He's in business. Patricia smiled the way women smile when they already think they know the answer. What kind of business? Before Naledi could speak, Madison jumped in with a laugh. Probably crypto or soccer investments, she said. That's all billionaires do overseas now, right? Adrian set his fork down harder than necessary. Madison. What? She replied innocently. I'm just making conversation. But she wasn't. We all knew it. Naledi kept her posture straight, though I noticed her fingers tightening slightly around her water glass. I'm afraid my father doesn't talk much about work at home, she said calmly. Patricia exchanged another look with Madison. That look irritated me more than I wanted to admit. The look women use when they've already decided someone's social worth. Outside, snow drifted softly against the dining room windows while inside the tension kept growing heavier by the minute. I tried redirecting the conversation. Naledi, Adrian mentioned you studied in London? Her face softened slightly. Yes, I went to King's College. Oh, Madison said, visibly surprised. Really? Naledi nodded politely. I moved there when I was 16. For school? Patricia asked. Yes. Patricia leaned back slowly in her chair. Well, that must have been quite an adjustment. Again, that tone. That careful upper-class tone designed to sound civilized while saying something cruel underneath. Adrian finally lost patience. What exactly is that supposed to mean? The entire table froze. Patricia blinked in mock surprise. Honestly, Adrian, don't be dramatic. We're only trying to get to know her. But his face had already hardened in a way I hadn't seen since his father's funeral. You're interrogating her, he said flatly. No, Madison laughed. We're just shocked you brought home someone so unexpected. The word hung in the air. Unexpected. As though Naledi were some embarrassing mistake standing beside my son instead of the woman he clearly loved. I looked toward her then. Really looked at her. She hadn't touched most of her dinner. But she still thanked the house staff every time they refilled her glass. Still smiled gently whenever anyone spoke to her directly. Still carried herself with more grace than the rest of us combined. And suddenly I remembered something my husband used to say years ago when Adrian was little. Money doesn't reveal character, Evelyn, it reveals the lack of it. At the time, I thought he meant poor people chasing wealth. That night, sitting beneath the crystal chandelier in our 12-seat dining room, I realized he'd been talking about us. The conversation limped forward awkwardly after that. My brother-in-law started discussing the stock market. Madison returned to her phone. Patricia continued sipping wine with the satisfied expression of someone who believed she was protecting the family bloodline from contamination. Then came the moment I still regret most. Patricia smiled directly at Naledi and asked, "Tell me honestly, dear, do you think you'll be comfortable fitting into a family like ours long-term?" The room went silent again. Adrian stared at his aunt in disbelief. Even Madison looked uncomfortable this time. But Naledi? She simply placed her napkin beside her untouched plate and smiled softly. I wasn't aware kindness required a certain tax bracket, she said. Nobody spoke after that. Not because she raised her voice. Not because she insulted anyone. But because for the first time all evening, someone at that table had spoken with actual dignity. And deep down, every one of us knew it. After dinner, Adrian asked Naledi if she wanted some air. She smiled gratefully and followed him toward the back terrace while the rest of us remained in the dining room pretending to care about coffee and dessert. The moment the sliding glass door closed behind them, Patricia let out a long breath. Well, she muttered, reaching for her wine again. That was uncomfortable. Madison laughed quietly. You're telling me, Adrian's completely blinded. I stood slowly and began gathering plates just to give my hands something to do. But nobody offered to help. They were too busy dissecting the young woman who had just sat at our table for 2 hours trying not to be humiliated. She's pretty, Madison admitted carelessly. I'll give her that. Patricia scoffed. Pretty girls are everywhere, that's hardly the point. And what exactly is the point? I asked before I could stop myself. Patricia looked at me with mild surprise. The point, Evelyn, is that Adrian comes from one of the most respected families in this city. People notice these things. These things. I hated that phrase instantly. Madison leaned against the marble counter scrolling through her phone. I mean, come on, she said, you know people are going to talk. About what? I asked again. This time neither of them answered immediately. Which told me everything. Finally Patricia lowered her voice. You can call me old-fashioned if you want, but relationships work better when people come from similar backgrounds. Similar backgrounds, Madison echoed quickly. Same values, same culture, same lifestyle. I stared down at the untouched dishes scattered across the table. Naledi had thanked me 3 separate times for dinner. Meanwhile my own family had spent the evening talking about her like she was an investment risk. She went to King's College, I said quietly. Patricia waved a dismissive hand. That doesn't mean anything anymore. Wealthy families send their children everywhere now. Something about the way she said wealthy families stayed with me. Because despite all her assumptions, none of us actually knew anything about Naledi. Not really. And yet everyone had already decided exactly who she was. Outside through the windows, I could see Adrian standing beside her near the garden lights. He was speaking softly while she listened with her arms folded tightly against the cold. Even from inside the house, I could see the sadness in her posture. My chest tightened unexpectedly. She handled herself better than most people would have, I murmured. Patricia gave a short laugh. Oh please, Evelyn, don't tell me you're falling for this act already. Act? Yes, the quiet, graceful routine. Girls like that know exactly what they're doing. Girls like that. There it was again. Not loud enough to call outright hateful. Just subtle enough to survive inside wealthy American families where people cared more about appearances than truth. At that moment the sliding door opened again. Adrian walked back inside alone. His expression immediately told me something had changed. Where's Naledi? I asked. She's calling her driver, he answered shortly. Madison blinked in surprise. Her driver? Adrian ignored her completely. Patricia crossed her arms. Honestly, Adrian, you shouldn't be angry with us for asking reasonable questions. Reasonable? He repeated. His voice was calm now. Too calm. You treated her like she was beneath you from the second she walked through that door. Patricia rolled her eyes. Oh, stop being dramatic. No, he said quietly. You stop pretending this is about culture or family values. Nobody spoke. Because he was right. And for the first time that evening, nobody at the table could hide behind polite smiles anymore. Adrian looked directly at me then. The disappointment in his eyes hurt worse than anger would have. I thought Mom raised us better than this, he said softly. Then he walked out before I could answer. A few seconds later, headlights swept across the front windows of the house. Madison wandered toward the entryway first. Then suddenly stopped. Oh my God, she whispered. Patricia frowned. What now? Madison turned slowly toward us, her face pale. There are 3 black SUVs outside. Before anyone could respond, a man in a dark suit stepped out of the first vehicle and opened the rear passenger door with careful precision. And that was the moment everything in our family began to change. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The entire house had gone strangely quiet except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock near the staircase. Madison was still standing by the front window staring outside like she'd seen a ghost. Patricia finally stood up with visible irritation. For heaven's sake, what is everyone acting so dramatic about? Then she looked outside herself. And stopped talking immediately. 3 black SUVs sat in perfect line across the circular driveway. Their headlights glowing against the falling snow. Men in dark suits stepped out carefully, scanning the property with the kind of calm professionalism you only see around people who are either extremely powerful or extremely wealthy. Maybe both. My brother-in-law let out a low whistle. Well, he muttered, that's not normal. No, it wasn't. Adrian stood near the front door with his coat still on, watching silently as one of the drivers opened the rear passenger door of the second SUV. An older gentleman stepped out slowly. Tall. Silver-haired. Elegant without trying to be. Even from inside the house. There was something unmistakable about the way he carried himself. The kind of confidence money alone doesn't buy. It comes from generations of power. Madison suddenly grabbed her phone. "Oh my God," she whispered again. Patricia frowned impatiently. "What now?" Madison looked up slowly. "I know who he is." Nobody answered. I could actually feel the tension spreading through the room. Madison swallowed hard. "That's Solomon Nkosi." The name landed heavily in the silence. Even I recognized it immediately. Everyone did. Solomon Nkosi wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the most influential businessmen in the world. His companies owned mining operations, technology firms, shipping investments, luxury hotels. Forbes talked about him constantly. Financial networks followed him like celebrities. And suddenly all those ugly little assumptions made during dinner felt unbearably small. Patricia's face lost color almost instantly. "That's impossible," she murmured. But it wasn't. Outside, Naledi stepped carefully down the front walkway toward him. The older man smiled warmly the moment he saw her. Not like a billionaire greeting an heiress. Like a father greeting his daughter. He adjusted her scarf gently against the cold while she said something that made him laugh softly. Such a small moment. Such an ordinary moment. And somehow it made me feel even worse about the way we'd treated her. Behind me, my brother-in-law suddenly straightened his jacket. Madison quickly fixed her hair using her phone camera reflection. Patricia actually reached for lipstick. I stared at them in disbelief. 10 minutes earlier they had treated that young woman like she didn't belong in our home. Now they looked ready to run outside and shake her father's hand. Money really does reveal character. Just not the way most people think. "Adrian," Patricia said quickly, her voice completely different now. "Why didn't you tell us who her family was?" My son turned toward her slowly. And the expression on his face made my stomach tighten. "Would it have mattered?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered him. Because again, we all knew the truth. Yes. It would have mattered. That was the ugliest part. The front door opened a moment later, letting cold winter air drift through the foyer. Naledi stepped inside first, snowflakes melting softly against her dark curls. Her father followed behind her calmly. The entire room transformed instantly. Smiles appeared. Voices softened. Patricia practically floated forward. "Mr. Nkosi," she said warmly, extending her hand. "What an incredible surprise." I watched Naledi's face carefully then. And for the first time all evening, I saw it. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just disappointment. Quiet disappointment. As though this reaction was something she had experienced many times before. Her father shook Patricia's hand politely. Then his eyes moved slowly across the room. Calm. Observant. Sharp enough to miss absolutely nothing. "I hope," he said gently, "my daughter hasn't been any trouble tonight." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened during dinner. Nobody answered Solomon Nkosi's question right away. Not Patricia. Not Madison. Not even me. Because the truth was sitting there in plain sight like dirty dishes after a funeral dinner. Naledi saved us before the silence became unbearable. "They were welcoming," she said softly. I turned toward her immediately. Welcoming. That was the word she chose after spending 2 hours being dissected like a social experiment at our dining table. Her father looked at her carefully for a moment. Long enough to know she was protecting us. Then he smiled politely. "I'm glad to hear that." Patricia recovered first. "Well, of course," she laughed lightly, "we were just getting to know each other." Adrian actually let out a quiet breath through his nose at that. Not quite a laugh, more disbelief than amusement. I noticed Solomon Nkosi notice it too. Nothing seemed to escape that man. I invited them both back toward the sitting room, mostly because standing frozen in the foyer felt ridiculous at that point. The fire still crackled softly in the stone fireplace while half-empty wine glasses sat abandoned across the coffee table. Everything suddenly looked different to me. Smaller somehow. Cheap, even. Not because our home lacked money, but because the atmosphere lacked grace. Solomon removed his gloves slowly before sitting beside his daughter. I apologize for arriving unannounced, he said calmly. Naledi mentioned the weather was worsening, and I preferred she didn't leave alone tonight. His voice carried the same quiet confidence she had. Controlled. Measured. Patricia practically glowed now that she knew who he was. Oh, Mr. Nkosi, no apology necessary. We're honored to have you here. Honored. Interesting word choice from someone who had practically interrogated his daughter 40 minutes earlier. Madison suddenly jumped into the conversation too. I read an article about your renewable energy project in Kenya last month, she said quickly. It was incredible. Solomon smiled politely. That's kind of you. But his eyes never warmed. I don't think he trusted any of us anymore. And honestly, I couldn't blame him. Adrian sat beside Naledi quietly, though I noticed his hand resting protectively against hers now. Earlier in the evening, she had looked nervous entering our home. Now he looked protective entering his own family. That realization hurt more than I expected. Eventually Patricia leaned forward carefully. You know, she said, I hope you didn't misunderstand some of our questions earlier. We're just very protective of Adrian. There it was. The attempt to rewrite history. Solomon looked at her calmly. I understand, he said. Then after a brief pause, he added quietly. My daughter has spent most of her life around people who become kinder the moment they learn her last name. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for their drinks. Because he hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't accused anyone directly. But somehow that sentence exposed the entire evening perfectly. Naledi lowered her eyes slightly. Almost embarrassed. Like this conversation exhausted her more than it angered her. Patricia forced a tight smile. Well, I certainly hope you don't think that applies to us. This time Solomon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced slowly around the room. At the crystal chandelier. The expensive artwork. The polished marble floors. Then finally at me. You remind me of something my late wife used to say, he said gently. There are people who inherit wealth, and people who inherit class. The two are not always the same. I felt that sentence land directly in my chest. Because deep down, I knew exactly which kind of family we had become after my husband died. A family obsessed with appearances. With status. With control. And somewhere along the way, we had forgotten how to recognize decency when it was sitting right in front of us. Outside, snow continued falling softly beyond the windows. Inside, the warmth from the fireplace suddenly felt uncomfortable against my skin. Then Naledi stood slowly. We should go, she said quietly. Adrian looked at her immediately. You don't have to. But she gave him a small tired smile. And in that moment, she no longer looked hurt. She looked disappointed. As though she had hoped for something better from us. And somehow, that felt far worse. Adrian insisted on walking Naledi and her father outside. Nobody tried stopping them. Not after the way the evening had unraveled. The front door closed softly behind them, leaving the rest of us standing in uncomfortable silence beneath the chandelier. Then Patricia exhaled sharply and reached for her wine again. Well, she muttered, that certainly explains a few things. I stared at her. Explains what? She looked genuinely confused by my question. The confidence, she said, the education, the attitude, obviously she comes from money. There it was again. That obsession with wealth as some kind of moral qualification. Madison sat slowly on the couch now, still pale from embarrassment. I can't believe we talked to her like that, she whispered. But Patricia waved her off immediately. Oh stop, nobody was rude. I almost laughed hearing that. Not because it was funny. Because wealthy people have a special talent for pretending cruelty doesn't count unless someone screams. You practically interrogated her, I said quietly. Patricia turned toward me with irritation. For heaven's sake, Evelyn, we were trying to protect Adrian. No, I replied before I could stop myself. You were trying to protect the family image. The room fell silent again. Even my brother-in-law looked uncomfortable now. Because deep down, everyone knew it was true. For years our family had measured people using invisible scales. Money. Connections. Education. Last names. We just preferred not admitting it out loud. Outside through the front windows, I could still see Adrian standing beside Naledi near the SUVs. Snow drifted softly around them while Solomon Nkosi spoke quietly with one of the security men. Then something unexpected happened. Naledi laughed. A real laugh this time. Small, warm, genuine. And Adrian smiled immediately the moment he heard it. The tension disappeared from his shoulders for the first time all evening. I watched them standing together beneath the falling snow, and suddenly they looked less like a scandal and more like something painfully simple. Two people trying to protect each other. My chest tightened unexpectedly. Because somewhere during dinner, I had stopped seeing Naledi as my son's guest and started seeing her as a young woman we had failed. A few minutes later Adrian came back inside alone. His expression was calm now. Too calm. Did they leave? I asked softly. He nodded. She was tired. Nobody spoke after that. Patricia finally cleared her throat. Well, I hope she understands nobody meant any harm. Adrian looked directly at her. I think she understood perfectly. The quietness in his voice scared me more than anger would have. Madison shifted awkwardly on the couch. I really didn't know who she was, she said. Adrian's eyes moved toward her slowly. That's exactly the problem. Again, silence. He removed his coat carefully before continuing. You all decided what kind of person she was within 30 seconds of meeting her. Patricia crossed her arms defensively. Oh please, don't act like race had anything to do with this. Adrian actually stared at her in disbelief. What else would it have been? Nobody answered. Because there was no good answer left. The fire crackled softly in the sitting room while outside the storm continued building across the dark neighborhood. I suddenly felt very old. Not because of my age. Because I realized how many things I had ignored for years simply to keep family dinners peaceful. The subtle comments. The coded language. The obsession with good families. My husband used to challenge people when they spoke that way. After he died, I think I became quieter. Maybe too quiet. Adrian looked at me then. Not angrily. That somehow made it worse. I brought her here because she matters to me, he said softly. I thought my family would at least try to know her before judging her. His voice lowered after that. But I was wrong. Then he turned and walked upstairs without waiting for anyone to answer. A few seconds later we heard the bedroom door close above us. And for the first time in years, our beautiful expensive house no longer felt impressive to me. It just felt empty. I barely slept that night. Long after everyone left, I sat alone in the kitchen staring at the untouched dessert trays while snow pressed softly against the windows. The house had finally gone quiet. No more fake laughter. No more polite cruelty wrapped in expensive perfume and crystal glasses. Just silence. I kept thinking about Naledi's face during dinner. Not angry. Not defensive. Just tired. As though she'd spent years walking into rooms exactly like ours. Rooms where people smiled first and judged second. Around 2 in the morning, I wandered into my late husband's study. I still hadn't changed much in there since he passed. His leather chair remained near the fireplace. Family photos still lined the shelves beside financial awards and framed newspaper articles about the company. There was one photograph in particular I couldn't stop staring at that night. Adrian at 12 years old. Smiling beside his father during a charity fundraiser downtown. Back then my husband used to tell him something constantly. Character is how you treat people who cannot benefit you. At the time, Adrian understood that lesson better than the rest of us. Somewhere along the way, our family forgot it. The next morning the tension inside the house felt unbearable. Patricia stayed overnight because the roads were icy, though by breakfast she acted as if nothing important had happened. Madison sat quietly scrolling through headlines on her phone while Patricia criticized the coffee being too weak. Nobody mentioned Naledi, which somehow made everything worse. Finally I asked the question sitting heavily in my chest since midnight. Did any of you actually feel ashamed about last night? Patricia looked up immediately. Oh Evelyn, not this again. Yes, I said calmly, this again. She placed her coffee cup down with visible irritation. We asked a few questions. You're acting like we committed some terrible crime. Madison shifted uncomfortably beside her. But I couldn't stop now. Would you have treated her the same way if she'd walked in and introduced herself as Solomon Nkosi's daughter from the beginning? Patricia opened her mouth. Then closed it again. That silence answered everything. I looked toward Madison next. Even she avoided my eyes. The worst part wasn't the judgment itself. It was how quickly everyone changed once money entered the room. Within seconds Patricia had transformed from suspicious to charming. Madison suddenly became interested in African investment projects she'd probably never cared about before. And I hated admitting my own guilt most of all. Because I hadn't defended Naledi when I should have. I stayed polite. Quiet. Passive. Just like so many women in wealthy families are taught to be. Around 10 o'clock Adrian finally came downstairs. He looked exhausted. His jaw was tense, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes like he hadn't slept either. Nobody spoke at first. Then Patricia forced a careful smile. Is Naledi feeling better this morning? Adrian stared at her for a long moment. You don't get to suddenly care now. The room immediately froze. Patricia's expression hardened. Excuse me? You heard me. His voice remained calm, but the disappointment underneath it was impossible to miss. She spent the entire night apologizing to me for making things uncomfortable. He continued quietly. Can you imagine that, after the way all of you treated her? Madison looked down at her lap. Even Patricia seemed caught off guard by that. Because truly decent people often do something strange after being humiliated. They blame themselves. Adrian rubbed a tired hand across his face before speaking again. You know what the saddest part is? He asked softly. Naledi told me she expected this before we even arrived. That sentence hit me harder than anything else. Expected this. Meaning she had already learned what people saw when they looked at her. Not intelligence. Not kindness. Not grace. Just skin color and assumptions. Adrian looked directly at me then. I need to know something, Mom. His voice softened slightly. If Dad were still alive, would last night have happened the same way? I opened my mouth to answer. But no words came out. Because deep down, I already knew the truth. No. It wouldn't have. Adrian left the house shortly after breakfast. He didn't slam the door. Didn't raise his voice. That somehow made the tension worse. The silence he left behind settled over the house like cold fog. Patricia tried pretending everything would blow over in a few days. By noon she was already discussing an upcoming charity gala as if our family hadn't just exposed something ugly about itself the night before. But I couldn't stop thinking about Adrian's question. If my husband were alive, would any of this have happened? The answer haunted me because I already knew it wasn't only about race. It was about power. About who society automatically respects and who it doesn't. And somewhere over the years, our family had quietly learned to worship status while pretending to value character. That afternoon I found myself doing something unusual. I called Naledi. At first I almost hung up before the call connected. What exactly was I supposed to say? Sorry my family treated you like a problem to solve? Sorry I sat there and let it happen? But before I could lose my nerve, her soft voice answered. Hello? For a second I couldn't speak. Then finally I said quietly, Naledi, this is Evelyn. A brief pause followed. Not hostile. Just cautious. I hope I'm not bothering you. I continued. You're not. There was still kindness in her tone after everything that happened. That alone made me feel worse. I stared out the kitchen window while snow melted slowly across the backyard garden. I wanted to apologize, I said softly, for last night, for all of it. The line stayed quiet for a moment. Then Naledi answered gently. You don't owe me an apology for other people's behavior. Yes, I whispered, I do. Because I had been the hostess. The mother. The one person in that house who should have protected her once things turned ugly. Instead, I chose politeness over courage. Women from families like ours are trained that way early. Keep the peace. Avoid conflict. Smile through discomfort. I suddenly realized how much damage that silence can cause. Naledi exhaled softly on the other end of the call. I know Adrian loves his family, she said carefully. I would never want to come between that. Something about those words broke my heart a little. Because she still worried about protecting us. Even now. Can I ask you something honestly? I said. Of course. Did you really expect that kind of reaction before coming here? Another pause. This one longer. Then finally she gave a small sad laugh. My father prepared me for rooms like that a very long time ago. I closed my eyes. Rooms like that. Not our house specifically. But wealthy spaces where she would always be examined first and welcomed second. When I was younger, she continued quietly, I used to think if I spoke perfectly, dressed correctly, attended the right schools, people would see me differently. And now? Now I know some people decide who you are before you even sit down. Her voice never sounded bitter. That was the part one couldn't stop thinking about afterward. No bitterness. Just exhaustion. As though she had spent years carrying other people's assumptions without complaint. We spoke another few minutes after that. About Chicago weather. About Adrian as a child. About her work with educational charities overseas. And the more she spoke, the more ashamed I became of our family's behavior. By the end of the call, one thing had become painfully clear. Naledi Nkosi possessed more grace at 30 years old than most people in our social circle ever develop in a lifetime. After we hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time staring at my cold coffee. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. Lunch at the club tomorrow? We should discuss how to handle Adrian. Handle Adrian. Not apologize to him. Not reflect on what happened. Handle him. That was when I realized the problem inside our family ran far deeper than one ugly dinner. And for the first time in years, I found myself wondering whether my son might eventually have to choose between the people who raised him and the woman who truly understood him. The lunch at the country club happened 2 days later. I almost canceled twice before leaving the house. Part of me already knew I didn't want to hear whatever Patricia planned to say about Adrian and Naledi. But another part of me needed to see whether I was imagining things. Whether our family had truly become as shallow as it suddenly seemed. The answer came within 10 minutes of sitting down. Patricia arrived wearing cream cashmere and diamonds large enough to catch the afternoon sunlight pouring through the restaurant windows. Madison joined us shortly afterward carrying a designer handbag that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. Everything looked polished. Elegant. Respectable. That's the dangerous thing about wealthy environments. Cruelty often arrives looking beautiful. The waiter poured sparkling water while Patricia leaned forward immediately. So, she said quietly, we need to discuss Adrian before this gets serious. I felt tired the moment she said it. Serious? I repeated. You know exactly what I mean. Madison lowered her menu carefully. I think everyone's just worried he's moving too fast. No. That wasn't what worried them. And for the first time in years, I no longer felt interested in pretending otherwise. You weren't worried before you learned who her father was, I said calmly. Both women went still. Patricia recovered first, though her smile tightened immediately. That's not fair. Isn't it? She exhaled sharply. Evelyn, please stop turning this into something ugly. We're talking about compatibility. There was that word again. Compatibility. A polite upper-class substitute for things people no longer wanted to say directly. I stirred my coffee slowly. She's educated, kind, intelligent. Adrian clearly loves her. What exactly makes them incompatible? Neither of them answered immediately. Because again, the truth sounded too ugly once spoken aloud. Finally Patricia lowered her voice. Our family lives a certain way. I looked at her carefully. And what way is that? She hesitated. Then came the sentence that finally shattered whatever patience I still had left. People notice differences, Evelyn, whether we like it or not. Differences. Not values. Not behavior. Not character. Just differences. I suddenly remembered Naledi sitting quietly at our dinner table thanking the staff while the rest of us judged her between wine courses. And I felt embarrassed all over again. Madison leaned closer now. Socially, this could become complicated for Adrian. She said carefully. Business relationships matter. Public image matters. There it was. The real fear. Not that Naledi lacked dignity, but that our social circle might react to her presence. I set my coffee cup down gently before speaking. Do either of you hear yourselves right now? Patricia frowned. We're being realistic. No, I said quietly. You're being small. The silence that followed stretched heavily across the table. Even nearby conversations from other club members suddenly sounded distant to me. For years I had sat beside these women at charity galas, holiday parties, fundraising dinners. I thought refinement meant kindness. Now I realized refinement often just teaches people how to hide their cruelty better. Patricia's expression hardened completely. You're letting emotion cloud your judgment. I almost laughed hearing that. Because emotion had nothing to do with it anymore. Truth did. My son brought home a good woman, I said softly, and our family treated her like she needed to earn basic respect. Madison shifted awkwardly. We didn't know who she was. That's exactly the point. Again, silence. For the first time since my husband died, I found myself speaking the kinds of truths he used to say out loud without fear. And strangely enough, it felt like breathing fresh air after years inside a locked room. Patricia finally leaned back in frustration. Well, she muttered coldly. If Adrian chooses her over this family, he'll regret it eventually. I looked out across the snow-covered golf course beyond the club windows. Then I answered quietly. No. I paused before turning back toward her. I think he'll regret us. A week passed before I saw Naledi again. Adrian invited me to a small fundraising event downtown for an educational nonprofit she supported. At first I assumed it would be another glamorous billionaire function full of cameras and champagne. It wasn't. The event was held inside a renovated community center on the south side of Chicago. Old brick walls, folding chairs, teachers serving coffee from silver dispensers near the back of the room. Simple. Warm. Real. I arrived early and almost didn't recognize Naledi at first. There were no designer gowns. No security convoy. No polished billionaire image. She stood near a group of teenage girls helping them organize scholarship applications while laughing softly at something one of them had said. And every single person in that room seemed to genuinely adore her. Not because of her father. Because of her. One of the volunteers recognized me from Adrian's family photos online and smiled warmly. You must be Adrian's mother, she said. Naledi talks about him constantly. Something about hearing that affected me more than I expected. I spent the next hour quietly watching her move through the room. She remembered everyone's names. She noticed when a little boy spilled juice and knelt to help clean it herself before staff could step in. She listened when people spoke. Really listened. There was no performance in it. No social climbing. No arrogance. And slowly, an uncomfortable realization settled deeper inside me. The women at my country club would spend $20,000 on charity auctions just to get their names printed in magazines. Naledi spent her weekends helping children nobody important would ever notice. The difference between wealth and character had never looked clearer to me. Later that evening Adrian introduced me to one of the board members. An older professor from Northwestern. The woman smiled immediately when she heard my last name. Oh, she said warmly, you raised a remarkable son. I glanced toward Adrian across the room. He was standing beside Naledi carrying folding chairs after the event ended. Even though several volunteers had already offered to do it for him. For the first time in months, he looked genuinely peaceful. Then the professor added something unexpected. Naledi's remarkable too. She turned down positions at 3 major firms to focus on nonprofit education work. I blinked. Turned them down? The woman nodded. She could have lived anywhere in the world doing almost anything she wanted. But she said she was tired of rooms where people only respected power. That sentence stayed with me. Because ironically, she had walked directly into another room exactly like that when she met our family. A little later, while volunteers stacked tables around us, I finally apologized to her properly face to face. Not the polite apology from our phone call. A real one. I failed you that night, I said quietly. Naledi looked surprised. You don't owe me. Yes, I interrupted softly. I do. She studied me carefully then. Not suspiciously. Just thoughtfully. My father always says people reveal who they are under discomfort, she said gently, not under comfort. I looked down at my hands. And what did my family reveal? Naledi hesitated. The fact that she still tried protecting my feelings after everything almost made it worse. Finally she answered quietly. That they care very deeply about belonging. Belonging. Such a gentle word for something that had felt so cruel. Before I could respond, Adrian walked over carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to Naledi first without even thinking about it. A small gesture. Automatic. Loving. Watching them together felt strangely painful and comforting at the same time. Because for the first time, I understood what Patricia and the others had truly feared. Not scandal. Not public opinion. Not social differences. They feared change. They feared losing control over the kind of family narrative wealthy people spend generations carefully protecting. But standing inside that modest community center watching my son smile beside a woman with more grace than anyone in our social circle, I realized something quietly devastating. Maybe the best thing Adrian could do for his future was walk away from the world that raised him. 3 weeks later, the entire family gathered again at my house. This time it wasn't for a birthday or holiday dinner. It was for my late husband's annual foundation banquet planning meeting, the kind of event our family treated almost like royal tradition. Business partners attended, politicians sometimes appeared, local newspapers covered it every year. And for decades, our family image had been carefully displayed there like polished silver. Perfect. Respectable. Untouchable. Patricia arrived first wearing another tailored cream suit that made her look permanently prepared to judge someone. Madison followed carrying folders for seating arrangements while my brother-in-law immediately started discussing donors and sponsorships. Nobody mentioned Naledi at first. But tension sat quietly beneath every conversation. Because everyone knew Adrian planned to bring her that evening. Patricia finally closed the dining room door behind us before lowering her voice. We need to settle this before tonight. I looked up from the paperwork in front of me. Settle what? You know exactly what. Madison shifted awkwardly near the window. Patricia folded her hands carefully. If Adrian insists on bringing her to the banquet, people will talk. There it was again. People. Those mysterious invisible judges wealthy families hide behind whenever they want to justify cruelty. I stared at her calmly. People already talk about this family. Patricia. She frowned immediately. What's that supposed to mean? It means pretending to be respectable and actually being respectable are not the same thing. The room went silent. My brother-in-law muttered something under his breath before focusing very hard on his coffee cup. Patricia's expression hardened. You're becoming emotional about this. No, I replied softly, I'm becoming honest. That sentence surprised even me. Because honesty had become strangely unfamiliar inside our family over the years. Everything was always filtered through appearances first. How things looked. How they sounded. How they reflected on the family name. Very little about who people actually were. Patricia leaned forward now, lowering her voice further. Evelyn, listen to me carefully. Adrian is about to inherit leadership of this company. Optics matter. I almost laughed hearing that word. Optics. Such a polished way to describe prejudice. Your worried donors might see a black woman beside him, I said quietly. Madison immediately looked down. Patricia's face flushed red. That is not what I said. No, I answered, it's what you meant. For a moment nobody moved. Outside the dining room windows, snow melted slowly beneath weak afternoon sunlight while inside the air felt cold enough to crack. Then Adrian walked in unexpectedly. Nobody had heard him arrive. He stood near the doorway looking at all of us silently. And from the expression on his face, I realized he had heard enough. Patricia recovered first. Adrian, we were only discussing tonight's event. No, he said calmly. You were discussing Naledi. The room froze. His voice stayed controlled, but there was something final inside it now. Something tired. I spent my entire life believing this family cared about values. He continued quietly. Integrity, character, respect. He looked directly at Patricia then. But apparently those values only apply to people you approve of. Patricia stood immediately. That's unfair. No, Adrian said. What's unfair is watching the woman I love walk into rooms where she has to prove her humanity before anyone offers basic decency. Nobody answered him. Because there was nothing left to defend. The silence stretched heavily across the room until finally Adrian turned toward me. And his expression softened slightly. Mom, he said quietly, I need to ask you something honestly. I felt my chest tighten immediately. If this family forces me to choose. He paused briefly. Are you going to stand with them, or with me? The question settled into the room like smoke after a fire. And suddenly I realized this was no longer about one ugly dinner. It was about the kind of people we had become. And whether there was still enough courage left inside me to change. Nobody spoke after Adrian asked that question. The silence inside the dining room felt heavier than every argument we had avoided for years. Patricia looked away first. Madison stared down at the carpet. Even my brother-in-law suddenly seemed fascinated by the snow melting outside the windows. Because deep down, everyone understood what was happening. This was no longer about Naledi. It was about whether our family's love came with conditions. I looked at my son standing in the doorway, and for a moment I didn't see the successful executive everyone admired. I saw the little boy who used to help his father shovel snow from the driveway before school. The teenager who volunteered at homeless shelters during Christmas because my husband believed privilege meant responsibility. The young man who once told me, at 16 years old, Dad says people show you who they are when they think they're better than someone else. Somewhere along the way, the rest of us forgot that lesson. But Adrian hadn't. I stood slowly from my chair. My hands trembled slightly, though my voice stayed calm. If you have to choose between this family and the woman you love. I paused softly. Then this family has already failed you. Patricia inhaled sharply. Evelyn. No, I said quietly, turning toward her for the first time without fear. Enough. The room fell completely still. For weeks all of you have hidden behind words like tradition, optics, compatibility. My voice remained steady, but what you really meant was that Naledi didn't look like the kind of woman you imagined beside Adrian. Nobody denied it. Because finally, there was nothing left to hide behind. I looked back toward my son. Your father would have been ashamed of us, I whispered. Adrian's face changed instantly at that. Not anger. Not victory. Just sadness. The kind that comes when someone finally says the truth out loud too late. A few days later, the foundation banquet took place downtown exactly as scheduled. Hundreds of guests attended. Politicians. Executives. Donors. The same polished world our family had spent decades trying to impress. And that night, Adrian walked into the ballroom beside Naledi. Not apologetically. Not cautiously. Proudly. She wore a simple dark blue gown with her curls falling softly over one shoulder. Elegant, graceful, calm. I noticed something immediately. People gravitated toward her naturally. Not because of her father's wealth. Because she listened when people spoke. Because she treated servers with the same respect she gave investors. Because real grace never needs to announce itself. Halfway through the evening, I caught Patricia watching Naledi from across the ballroom with a strange expression on her face. Not hatred anymore. Regret. But by then, it was too late to undo first impressions. Later that night, while the orchestra played softly beneath the ballroom lights, Adrian found me standing alone near the terrace doors. You okay? He asked gently. I smiled faintly. I think so. Naledi joined us a moment later holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to me first. Such a small gesture. But somehow it nearly made me cry. For a long moment, the 3 of us simply stood there together watching snow fall across the city skyline. Peaceful. Quiet. Real. Then Adrian wrapped an arm gently around Naledi's shoulders and looked at me carefully. Thank you, he said softly. I knew he wasn't talking about the banquet. He meant choosing him. Choosing decency. choosing courage after years of silence, and standing there beside them. I finally understood something my husband had tried teaching this family our entire lives. Money can build beautiful houses. Status can open important doors. But neither one means anything if the people inside those houses forget how to treat others with humanity. We spent an entire evening judging the color of Niletti's skin and the assumptions attached to her name. And in the process, we revealed far more about ourselves than we ever did about her. Because in the end, the wealthiest person in the room wasn't the billionaire's daughter. It was the young woman who walked into a hostile house, and still chose grace anyway.